Morning, everybody. First of all, my sincere thanks to Richard van Leeuwen and Jan Loop for the kind invitation to participate at this meeting commemorating Galon. There's a whole series of similar meetings all over Europe, but this one is certainly, well, in one of the nicest buildings I've ever been so far. As you all know, it is a rare occasion that as a speaker you are being asked to extend your talk, as usually you're being asked to keep within the time limit. Fortunately, I had two versions of my paper with me, a shorter and a longer one, so I'm actually going to present the longer version. My original title was announced as a scholar in the making. I have changed that title to a little more presumptuous one, which alludes to a fairly well-known book by a fairly well-known German author. And of course, the fairly well-known is slightly understated. My paper is now titled Antoine Galon's Journeyman Years. Galon's early travel diaries 1672 to 73 in the light of comparative folk narrative research. I was fascinated to hear Richard quote from Galon's communication with Cooper, and this is actually a motto I also took from their communication, a letter from Galon dated 1705, which again shows some of his ambiguity in translating the Nights. I mean, in 1705 he had started the work and was already fairly on his way, but this is what he said in this letter. This is the world. People have a stronger inclination towards entertainment than towards anything that requires an effort, however little it may be. Now, let me start my presentation. Research over the past centuries has shown that Antoine Galon's version of the 1001 Nights owes much to the unwitting collaboration of the Syrian Maronite storyteller Hannah Diab. Although Galon mentioned Hannah in his Parisian diaries, he never acknowledged his indebtedness to him publicly, and the scope of Hannah's contribution to the Nights is only recently being explored in detail. It was Hannah's performance that enabled Galon to create, or maybe we should say rather recreate, tales such as Aladdin and Ali Baba that today are perceived as the acme of Oriental storytelling. Using Hannah's tales to complement the fragmentary 15th century Arabic manuscript at his disposal, Galon not only fulfilled the expectations of his contemporary audience. Moreover, he demonstrated a remarkable instinct for recognizing the potential of a good story in editing some of the tales from Hannah's narrative repertoire and leaving aside others. This instinct went together with a pronounced penchant for stories and storytelling that Galon already demonstrated as a young man, when he was not yet the famed translator of the Mille et Une Nuits, but rather still in his formative period. Born in 1646, Galon published the first volume of the Nights since 1704, when he was in his late 50s. The publication of this 12-volume translation of the Nights took more than a decade, and the final two volumes he had prepared before his death in 1715 were only published posthumously in 1717. Galon's interest for stories and storytelling, however, already shows in the diaries preserved from his sojourn in Constantinople in 1672 to 73, when Galon was merely in the second half of his 20s. In the present paper, then, I suggest to explore these diaries in the light of comparative folk narrative research. Having studied Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and several other Oriental languages, Galon arrived in Constantinople in the company of the newly appointed French ambassador to the Sublime Porte, Charles-Marie François Ollier, the Marquis de Nantel. Galland's official duty was to serve as the ambassador's translator and theological attaché, who aimed to negotiate a signed declaration of faith from the Eastern Catholics concerning the understanding of transubstantiation. This aspect of Galland's mission apparently soon became secondary to his other interests, and the diaries he wrote during his first sojourn in Constantinople document a keen interest in cultural and political events of all kinds. One of Galland's regular occupations was the acquisition of antiquities, particularly books. To the modern reader, the anecdotal character of the diaries bespeaks a fascinating mixture of naivete and gradually growing expertise. For instance, on January 14, 1672, Galland acquired the 15th century magnificently illustrated Uyghur copy of the Me'rajname, a text about the Prophet Muhammad's ascension to heaven. Although the images enabled him to recognize the book's subject, he quotes the title as advertised by the bookseller as Ajaib al-Makhluqat, the wonders of creation, not realizing that, as Charles Schaeffer, the editor of Galland's diaries, later explained, that the booksellers apparently used this title as a generic denomination for any anonymous work adorned with miniatures. Moreover, Galland identified the script of this manuscript as old Kufi characters, and not as the vertically written Uyghur script it actually was. Then his short notes about the Divan-e-Hafiz, January 20, and the Shahnameh, January 21, betray that he had never seen those works before. The notice for January 29 demonstrates an admirably dutiful compulsion for writing his diary every day, as he took down, and I quote, there has been nothing notable today, only that at evening the wind changed to northeast with the snow melting. And in his detailed description of a procession of the Grand Vizier on May 7, 1672, he frankly admits that, quote, it is here that I would need all the help rhetoric can give to anybody so as to achieve the description of whatever remains of that magnificence. This subject is ultimately beyond my capacity, and even if I did not lack all that help, I doubt that it would be useful for me, as I believe that it is something ultimately beyond whatever can be explained and expressed by the mediation of words. Conceding the limitations of his rhetorical capacity, Galland nevertheless was a keen observer of daily events and contemporary life, and the numerous books he saw, bought and read, as well as the tales he listened to, contributed to his growing expertise for narratives of all kind, a genre he usually termed fable. Of the tale of the woodcutter Yusuf Odunju, told by a certain Ibrahim Effendi on August 5, 1672, he unfortunately only took down the title, probably not deeming the tale to deserve being retold in full. Woodcutters are stock characters in Turkish and, for that matter, Persian folktales, and so it is impossible to reasonably argue in favor of a specific tale. When the same Ibrahim Effendi narrated to him an etiological legend about the origin of fleas and lice a few days before, Galland obviously found the tale so original that he wrote down an extensive summary. And I quote his summary. They say that when Noah's Ark was traveling on the surface of the waters that covered the whole earth, it had a hole through which a lot of water entered. As the Holy Patriarch was strongly concerned to remedy this inconvenience, the snake approached him and addressed him, saying that it could find the means to plug that hole and stop the water from entering into the ark, if he would promise in return to grant the snake a living from the blood of human beings. The Patriarch granted the request in order to stop as soon as possible what could have caused the submersion of the ark and the complete annihilation of the human race. The snake took its words and kept the promise it had made. It curled itself several times and skillfully plugged the hole through which the water had entered. When the waters had retreated and all of the animals had left the ark, the snake presented itself to Noah, demanding that he give it what he had promised. At that moment, the patriarch found himself in great distress and did not know how to satisfy the snake's request. But then the angel Gabriel helped him, appearing to him and ordering him to make a fire and throw the snake into the fire. And this is what Noah immediately did. After the snake had burned, the ashes divided themselves into two pots. One part was transformed to fleas, and the other to lice, both of which attacked the veins and started to nourish themselves with blood. They communicated this habit to their descendants, multiplied until today, and do not stop to plague us. Recorded by Galland without any further comment, the comparative data presently available prove this legend to belong to a large body of narratives related to the deluge that has been discussed in detail in Oscar Dänhardt's early 20th century study of Natursagen, that is, legends concerning nature. Quoting closely similar versions from Romanian, Kurdish, and Turkish tradition, and positing those versions in a much larger web of international tradition, Dänhardt suggests the legend to have arisen from an unspecific Islamic context. Little did Dänhardt, nor for that matter Galland, realize that the legend had already been reported in the famous mid-17th century travel account compiled by the Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, who quoted it in relation to the Kurds living at the foot of the Sinjar Mountains in northern Iraq. Whether Galland's informant knew Evliya Çelebi's travel account or not must remain open to speculation, since both probably drew on the same sources. The subsequent dissemination of the tale in Western scholarship, however, is quite remarkable. It was Austrian Ottomanist scholar Josef von Hammer who, in a review article published in the Vienna Jahrbücher der Literatur in 1821, and again in a footnote to his Geschichte des Osmanischen Reiches in 1828, initiated a highly influential sequence of quotations of the tale from Evliya Çelebi. At first resulting in a short hype of quotations in learned journals in England, the tale's repercussions in contemporary scientific literature culminated even in its inclusion in the second volume of James Rennie's Natural History of Insects in 1835, where, sadly enough, Evliya Çelebi's name has been distorted beyond recognition to Evelyn, or maybe we should even pronounce it Yulin. Although only published in 1881, Galland's text constitutes the first European rendering of a tale that subsequently enjoyed a considerable popularity in European learned and scientific literature, and the tale's quotation in his diary may serve as a good argument for acknowledging his remarkable instinct of recognizing the potential of specific narratives. To some extent, Galland's fascination with narratives related to literary sources, although we do not know whether he would actually read all of the classical Near Eastern compilations of historical or edifying narratives he bought or mentioned. On January 8, 1673, he bought a copy of the Arabic version of the collection of fables Khalil wa Dimna. On December 14, 1672, he referred to the Hebrew text of what he calls the fabulous history of Sandoval, obviously implying a version of the originally Persian Sindbadname, as the name Sandoval is a contortion of the Greek Sendebar. Galland states that the Hebrew text is more or less of the same genre as the Ottoman Kırk Vezir, the 40 Viziers, itself being a 14th or 15th century Ottoman adaptation of this originally Persian Sindbadname. The mention of this text furthermore prompts Galland to include a remark concerning what he conceives as a Turkish predilection for narratives that somehow goes together well with an earlier remark as for what he called the phlegmatic nature of the Turks. And he says the great quantity of tales and fables that the Turks have is an astonishing thing. One wonders about the length of our novels that have up to 10 or 12 volumes. The Turks have romances of Alexander of 120 volumes. There are others of 50, of 60, etc. And in the Bezestan, that is the covered and closed bazaar area in Constantinople, there are certain bookstalls that do no other business but rent those books for reading for 4 or 5 aspe. Above all, they have many customers in winter when the nights are long, because in those days the Turks have the habit of getting together to listen to somebody read those tales, for which they have such an absolutely great liking. On January 9, 1673, Galland bought a copy of the 15th century Ottoman compilation Ferej Ba'de Shidde, one of the earliest products of the old Anatolian Turkish literature in prose, that later served as the main source of inspiration for the 1001 Days, published 1710-12 by Galland's colleague and competitor François Petit-Lacroix. The Austrian scholar Andreas Tietze, who studied the Ferej Ba'de Shidde, was convinced that the book Galland had bought was one of those books that booksellers would lend to customers for reading or copying, a practice that incidentally also supplied the earliest, that is, in this case, mid-12th century documentary evidence for the common title of the book that later made Galland famous, Alf Leila wa Leila, or 1001 Nights. Gustav Flügel labeled an incomplete copy of Ferej Ba'de Shidde in Vienna a coffee house copy, cafe house exemplar. As the introductory passage mentions a meddah, that is a professional entertainer in the urban context. Tietze furthermore argued that by being lent out numerous times and by being read in public to considerable audiences that he called Vorlesekränzchen, even a single manuscript could become a veritable Volksbuch, a term that in the European context is usually applied to printed books that potentially reached a wide audience because they were produced in hundreds of copies. At any rate, Galland was so fascinated by the contents of Ferej Ba'de Shidde that he immediately started reading the book, summarizing 2 days later the story of the architect of the city of Bam, who constructed a magnificent palace for the king of Kashmir, hereby arousing the envy and active intervention of the king's malevolent viziers, who tried to discredit him by aiming to seduce his virtuous wife. Again, out of the manuscript's total of 42 tales, Galland instinctively chose a tale that deserves particular mention. Tietze, who studied this Ottoman manuscript in great detail, argued convincingly that many, if not most of the tales it contained had been translated from a Persian predecessor. Meanwhile, it is not easy to ascertain the sources the author of the Ottoman manuscript exploited. Obviously, he did not translate a single Persian book, but rather compiled his collection from a variety of sources, most probably the anonymous compilations of tales known under the generic title in Persian Jame al-Hikayat, or collection of stories. Although the best studied representative of this genre, the Mashhad manuscript that contains 46 tales, does not include the particular tale under consideration here, a lengthy version of the tale is included in another identically titled compilation that is today preserved in the Ganj Bakhsh library in Pakistan. Although the latter Persian manuscript apparently dates to the 18th century and thus is considerably younger than the Ottoman Ferej Ba'de Shidde, which dates from the 15th century, it draws on the repertoire of the older predecessors. The collection of tales compiled toward the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century by a certain Muhammad Qasim ibn Mirak Hossein Mozaffari Sajavandi, nicknamed Hoppi, that Tietze considered as a Persian analogy to Ferej Ba'de Shidde, also contains the tale in question. And the earliest dated copy of Jam al-Hikayat, the Persian collection, identified so far, that contains the tale has been completed in 1636. The story that Galland translated, the story of the architect of the city of Bam, thus not only proves to be entertaining and amusing, but also links Ottoman literature to the wider context of its neighboring literatures. Even though Galland acquired many other books whose narratives he might have recounted, such as the works of the Persian poets Sa'adi or Ferdowsi, he refrained from doing so. Instead, his note concerning the 16th century historical work Jawame at-Tawarikh, Persian, indicates that at times he would privilege his official mission to acquire books of a more immediate use to his sponsor. As on January 17, 1673, he makes the rather enlightened remark, quote, "I found this book excellent and very useful in order to understand the history of the Oriental people from their own point of view, without restricting ourselves to the reports of our own authors, who have always been too far away to be perfectly informed." And incidentally, as Richard quoted Galland's contribution to Barthélemy d'Herbelot's Bibliothèque Orientale, in the preface to that dictionary, he makes a fairly similar remark, although much more extensively. Even so, every now and then, Galland's vivid interest for entertaining tales from oral tradition would gain the upper hand, such as when on September 28, 1672, he notes having heard, quote, "the story of a king who had each of his newborn daughters put to death, since the astrologers had predicted that each daughter he would have would be a slut, and what became of the one whom one of his sons saved from that cruel sentence," end quote. As Galland did not elaborate on the content of this tale, we do not know exactly which tale he referred to, but the misogynist motif of the king ordering to kill any newborn child, should it be a daughter, is a stock motif, at least in Persian folktales. Particularly the initial set of motifs of the 19th century Persian chapbook romance Khosrow Div Zad, essentially a version of International Tale Type 315, The Faithless Sister, fits the description so closely that Galland might have heard this or a similar tale. Depending on his informant's range of access to literary sources about which we do not have any information, it would also be tempting to relate the tale whose beginning Galland summarizes to the tale of Arus al-Arais, an Arabic tale, The Bride of Brides, which is the tale of a beautiful daughter who has been born under such a bad astrological constellation that she is fated to become more tricky, evil, false, and adulterous than any other human being. Remarkably, the singular 14th century Arabic manuscript containing this tale has been preserved in an Istanbul library and might even have been within reach for a learned reader in Galland's days. One of the oral informants Galland mentioned several times was the native teacher of the French language students in Constantinople, generically referred to as Hodja or Kodja, as he says in French, des enfants de langue, the language students. For instance, on June 22, 1672, Galland quotes him as an authority for the popular practice of preventing clippings of the reed pen from falling down to the ground, as even leftovers from an instrument used for writing the Quran, at least potentially, should not be soiled. And on January 1st, 1673, the Kodja brings him an anonymously compiled Mirror for Princes, whose simple discourse Galland finds, as he says, both elegant and convincing. The Kodja's most important contribution, and certainly the most wide-reaching traditional narrative of Galland's diary altogether, is the tale of the adventures of a certain Kodja Mozaffer that the language teacher performed orally on Friday, March the 3rd, 1673. And this is Galland's summary of the tale. Kodja Mozaffer, being a great traveler, he arrived at the city of Alim-Abad and spent the nights at the foot of its walls. In the morning, the nobles came out, and having met him, took him and made him their king. following the custom they had to replace their dead king with the first person they met outside the gates. They married him, and when his wife died after some time, they deposed him, following another custom, and obliged him to suffer being descended to an underground place where they brought him something to eat every day. Having found the wife of one of his predecessors who had experienced the same fate because her husband had died before her, he married her and had 2 male children with her. When they had been in that situation for 4 or 5 years, a serpent of marvelous size appeared at their place, and when they saw it retreat in the ground, they spontaneously decided that one of them should grab its tail, and the other one would hold on to the first one. This served them extremely well, since when the serpent had pulled them up to the surface of the earth, they were saved and found their way until they reached a place that was not far away from the sea. As the woman went to the shore to wash their clothes, a ship had come to pass at the same time, and she was noticed by those aboard. They came to the shore, took her, and carried her away, as Khoja Muzaffar was looking for her. Having waited for her quite long, a wolf carried away one of his sons, whom he had left alone. Together with the one that was left with him, he came to the side of a river. As he found neither bridge nor boat, he took it upon himself to swim across with his child. But the strong current obliged him to let him go, and he barely managed to save himself. The woman managed to buy her freedom by way of some jewels that she had with her, and disguising herself as a man, she still had enough to establish a nice shop. She stayed like this for several years, until her husband, who had all the time lived in a state of poverty and misery, arrived in the city where she was. He was at first introduced to her as being a person who was very charitable towards the poor. She recognized him as her husband, and it turned out that the governor of the city and the Qadi were the 2 children that had been lost. The first one had been saved from the mouth of the wolf by the king's shepherds, and the other one had been caught by a fisher, who had his wife bring him up and nourish him. This, Galland says, is the substance of the tale that he narrated, considerably longer, with all its details, and what I have just written serves only to help remind me of the rest. Now, Galland, I would say, obviously did not realize that the tale of Khoja Muzaffar is a fairly close retelling of actually the 42nd and ultimate story of the aforementioned 15th century Ottoman manuscript, the Ferrej Bad Shidda. In terms of content, Galland's retelling of the tale is remarkable in several respects. First, the tale is a specific combination of well-known motifs and episodes that are usually encountered in different contexts or that exist as separate tales. Second, the tale has experienced a peculiar fate in scholarly studies. And third, the final sentence of Galland's note adds a rare detail from his fieldwork practice that might well have bearings on the contextual interpretation of his other summaries of tales, such as those he put down from or after the oral performance of Hannah Diab, already mentioned by Richard, in Paris many years later. At any rate, the tale deserves a detailed analysis. For the sake of consistency, I will discuss the tale's 3 different constituents as equally valid episodes, even though the first unit is little more than a single motif, and both the second and the third units are fleshed out with the potential of existing as independent tales. The tale of Khoja Muzaffar begins with a motif of a stranger being chosen as the dead king's successor, through a procedure that, although it appears unusual, is commonly practiced in a particular kingdom. In Near Eastern folktales, the procedure is most often achieved as an ordeal, in which a bird settles on the head or shoulders of the chosen person. In this form, the motif happens to be a regular constituent of Persian versions of the final episode of the tale of Khoja Muzaffar. Incidentally, the specific procedure mentioned here, where the first person encountered outside of the city gates in the morning is to replace the dead king, also appears in the tale of Gulnaz in Denis Dominique Cardin's Mélange de littérature orientale, and that is a tale that treats the adventures of an unfortunate heroine who, because of her beauty, suffers multiple abuse by a series of dominant male characters. Cardin's book, first published in 1770, is a representative of the genre of Oriental miscellany that was popular in the French, English, and European literatures in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Given the entertaining nature of these books, the source of Cardin's Mélange mentioned summarily as translated from various Turkish, Arabic, and Persian manuscripts in the Royal Library. The specific tale under consideration here has been translated from a work titled Ajaib al-Ma'asir, Strange Tales, compiled by the early 17th century Ottoman author Ahmed Suhaili. At any rate, the introductory motif of the tale of Khoja Muzaffar can be shown to have been used in different contexts, and the appearance of the related motif of the choice of king by way of a bird in the Persian folktale appears to foreshadow a particular relation to the Ottoman tale's final episode, which I will discuss soon. Andras Hamori, and following him Maurice Pomerantz, have quoted the second episode of the tale of Khoja Muzaffar, in which the protagonist is buried together with his deceased wife, as constituting a relatively modern version of an episode that is best known as Sindbad, the seafaring merchant's fourth voyage. While Hamori feels that the tale of Khoja Muzaffar reads like an inflated and unconvincing derivative of the tale of Sindbad, Pomerantz argues that it seems to be an oral retelling of a specific maqama, written by the 16th century Arabic author As-Sayyid Abdurrahman al-Abbasi. Like the maqama, and unlike the episode in Sindbad's tales, Pomerantz says, quote, Muzaffar's beloved is a former royal, finds love and gets married underground. Indeed, both tales have identical plot structures. End quote. The identical structure of the two versions might also be explained by an as yet unidentified common source or an intermediary, as the motive of a husband being buried alive together with his recently deceased spouse was part and parcel of the narrative stock Near Eastern storytellers adapted in various contexts. As a matter of fact, the oldest version of this motif occurs in the Persian Mujmal at-Tawarikh wal-Qisas, a compendium of history and tales, an early 12th century compilation that, although known for long, has only fairly recently been edited in a critical edition based on all four manuscripts preserved today. In addition to versions of the international tale type 612, the three snake leaves, as documented in the Mashhad manuscripts of Jam al-Hikayat and in modern Turkish folktales, the motif also appears in the Persian Hamza romance. I realize that I'm mentioning all kinds of titles and you might be slightly confused, but rest assured this will once be published, and so you can read it in leisure. The oldest preserved version of the Persian Hamza romance, best known as Rumuz Hamza, dates at least from early in the 17th century. It includes an episode in which the hero, Omar Ma'di, arrives at a foreign city where he is elected successor of the recently deceased king by way of an ordeal involving a kite. Celebrating his unexpected new position, he gets drunk and requests his vizier to get him a woman to marry. Although the vizier cautiously informs him about the country's custom, that is, spouses are being alive with their deceased partners, the hero accepts and gets married. At the beginning of the night, he consummates the marriage, but at the end of the night, his wife is dead. The next day, the country's nobles request him to conform with the country's custom to have himself buried alive with his dead wife, and as he refuses, they drug him unconscious so as to execute their plan. The following events deviate from those in other versions, as now the romance's main protagonist arrives and saves him. 19th century Persian storytellers of more or less the same story, felt the need to rationalize the young woman's sudden death, as they have her die from the hero's brute sexuality in the wedding night. This rationalization, moreover, allows them to introduce the custom of the surviving spouse being buried alive in a different manner. In this version, the nobles reckon that should they keep their new king, the country would soon have no women left. Incidentally, this motif, as you will certainly have recognized, links the frame tale to the knights. Well, links the tale to the frame tale of the knights, as King Shahryar's habit of killing his wife after the wedding night also threatens to eliminate the country's marriageable women. The solution for the problem offered here in the storyteller's telling of the Rumuz Hamze is, however, different. In this version, the nobles prepare 2 graves and pretend to the hero that their custom is to have the husband buried alive with his dead wife. Although the hero refuses to obey, they pull him down from his horse and are about to bury him alive, when suddenly the romance's main protagonist arrives and saves him. Now, returning to my main argument, what is important for the present context then is the fact that the Ottoman tale of Khoja Mozaffar undoubtedly was Galland's first encounter with an episode he later met again in the Sindbad tales. And these are those tales that he chose to translate in full some 30 years later, and those tales that eventually inspired him to translate The 1001 Nights. Considering the historical circumstances, it is thus not unlikely that Galland's fascination with the Sindbad tales was triggered to some extent by a vague and maybe even unconscious memory of the tale he had heard in his younger days. None of the Orientalist discussions of the tale of Khoja Mozaffar so far have seriously considered the tale's third constituent. At worst, apparently regarding it as inconsequential and badly told, at best as irrelevant or superfluous. And yet this episode has received major attention in folklorist studies of a legend that in its Christian version is known as that of Eustachius or Placidas, of which the episode in the tale of Khoja Mozaffar is a prototypical version. Essentially, the plot is about a man who loses all of his family, first his wife and then his 2 young boys, one after the other, only to regain them later. The Christian legend was widely spread in the European Middle Ages, with its dominant version being told in the Legenda Aurea and in the Gesta Romanorum. To name but a few of its other prominent versions, it was also part of the 12th century German Kaiserchronik and the 13th century epics Beuve de Anton and the Libro del Caballero Cifar. Numerous versions of the tale that in comparative folk narrative research has been classified as tale type 938 exist in both Western and Eastern literatures and oral tradition. Since one of the tale's constitutive motifs, the scene of recognition at the tale's end, is first documented in Indian Buddhist tradition, research has variably argued for an Eastern origin and a subsequent dissemination towards the West, or vice versa, without ultimately convincing arguments from either side. Without going into further detail here, it appears unlikely that a man with Galland's erudition and knowledge of classical languages would not have read or otherwise known a version of the tale. Consequently, one of the reasons why, out of the many tales he must have listened to, Galland deemed the tale of Khoja Mozaffar worthy of being put down in writing might thus have been an uncanny, an unconscious familiarity with this part of the tale's plot, similar to the sensation he might have experienced when later encountering the Sindbad tales. Notably, the corpus of tales in the 1001 Nights also contains a total of 4 different versions of tale type 938, all of them, however, included in manuscripts that were not known to Galland. Now, having discussed the tale's constituents, a few words on the specific combination of tale types in the tale of Khoja Mozaffar are in order. Storytellers do not tell tale types. much as researchers would like the thought. They tell tales that folklorist research then assesses in analytical categories as narrative motifs and tale types. If one defines the analytical approach as standard, many a tale recorded from oral tradition risks to appear garbled, confused, contaminated, or simply badly told. And yet, from the storyteller's perspective, each tale makes sense, as the art of storytelling is to a large extent the art of combining various narrative elements, episodes, and tales into new and unexpected units. Some of the results of such a process of combination might be unusual or even unique, while others might gain currency and even become part of tradition. Folklorist method aims to analyze the tale's various components, but the perspective of comparative folk narrative research adds a new dimension with the potential of demonstrating to which extent a specific combination of motives is part of a larger tradition in time and space. The tale of Khoja Mozaffar serves as a case in point to demonstrate this theoretical assessment. The above discussion of the Turkish Ferej Ba'd Shidda and its proved or hypothetical connection with the Persian genre of Jami' al-Hikayat is also relevant for this particular tale, as the Mashhad manuscripts of the Jami' al-Hikayat, probably compiled at the beginning of the 18th century, includes a tale that also combines the episode from Sindbad's fourth voyage with the tale of the man who lost and regained his family. The tale in the Mashhad manuscript is embellished with various other elements and integrates the episode of being buried alive after the man's first wife had been abducted and the second wife, a cannibal princess, had died. Nevertheless, the occurrence of the tale in the Mashhad manuscript may here serve to argue that the specific combination of elements as occurring in the tale of Khoja Mozaffar is not unique, but rather belongs to a larger tradition that includes, at the very least, an Ottoman 15th century, a Persian early 17th century, and a Turkish mid-17th century version. The closely similar version of the tale in the Ottoman Ferej Ba'd Shidda begins with a traveler bragging about his experience and continues with the motif of the protagonist attaching himself to the claw of a giant bird, again a motif best known from Sindbad's second voyage. It then continues with all of the three elements analyzed above. Moreover, yet another version is given in the Turkish Kırk Vezir, the 40 Viziers, whose earliest dated manuscript was compiled in the middle of the 15th century. This version also includes the protagonist's marriage to the cannibal princess, and is thus closely similar to that in the Mashhad manuscript of Jami' al-Hikayat. Given the tale's popularity in a variety of literary sources, it is thus little surprising that it has also been recorded in a considerable number of versions from mid-20th century Turkish oral tradition. In their totality, these versions demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the combination of the three elements occurring in the tale of Khoja Mozaffar, that is the election of the new king by way of an ordeal, the husband being buried together with his deceased wife, and the man who lost and regained his wife and two sons. And this combination is not as haphazard a combination as it may seem at first sight. Of course, the combination must have been created under particular circumstances, and probably even by a single individual author. But once it had been created, it lived on in tradition, eventually constituting what folklorists label an oikotype, that is, a special version of an internationally distributed tale that is known in a limited and clearly defined regional context. In this understanding, even the truncated version of the first two elements as given in the Persian Hamzaname, where after the initial ordeal, the dilemma of the husband being buried with his wife leads to an unusual outcome, reads like an echo of a traditionally accepted combination that appears to have been popular in the pre-modern Ottoman Turkish and Persian literatures. Now, the second point for which the tale of Khoja Mozaffar is remarkable is the perception. with which it was received by different disciplines. All of the Orientalist studies dealing with the tale are conscious of the original context of its documentation. That is, the fact that the tale was taken down by Galland in his diary, following an oral performance in 17th century Turkey. Folklorist studies, to the contrary, and none of whom specializes in Eastern or Near Eastern narratives, are negligent in their reference to the tale's original context. Whereas the Orientalist studies as a rule refer directly to Galland's diary or to an excerpt of the diary published in the French Revue Rétrospective in 1837, the folklorist studies came to know the tale from the summary of Galland's summary presented by Victor Chauvin in the 6th volume of his Bibliographie des Ouvrages Arabes, the third one devoted to the 1001 Nights, published in 1902. Taking all of the tales discussed in that volume at their face value, that is, as actually constituting tales of the Nights, and not recognizing the position of some of them as comparative material, most of the post-Galland folklore studies regard the tale of Khoja Mozaffar as being part of the Nights. It is difficult to ascertain who started this fatal misunderstanding, but the series of quotation at least leads from Wilhelm Bousset, 1916, via Alexander Haggerty Crappy, 1926, and Germain Lemieux, 1970, to Elisabeth Schreiner's entry on Sifar in the Encyclopädie des Märchens in 1981. It makes little difference whether these studies quote the tale of Khoja Mozaffar as being part of the Nights or simply as being Arabic. All of them practice an uncritical reading of Galland and Chauvin, both of whom were perceived as authorities of Arabic narrative literature in attributing, and please remember that, the Ottoman tale performed for the man who later gained fame as the translator of the Nights, to the linguistic and cultural context of the famous collection. Now, as a final point, let me ponder shortly about the sentence that concludes the tale summary in Galland's diary. To remind you, this is what Galland says. This is the substance of the tale, that he, that is Galland's informant, narrated considerably longer with all its details, and what I have just written serves only to help remind me of the rest. This sentence is particularly relevant in relation to the origin of the most famous tales of the 1001 Nights, that is, those tales that Galland took down from the oral performance of Hannah Diab in his Parisian diary. Although Hannah's involvement in the compilation of the final volumes of Galland's Nights has been known for long, scholars have only quite recently started to wonder whether Galland wrote his summaries as field notes during Hannah's performance, or whether he summarized the tales from memory several hours later. Features of the language, such as the frequent use of etc. and other random abbreviations, or the hurried character of Galland's handwriting, are striking, but do not necessarily lead to a convincing conclusion. The Constantinople diaries are clear in that respect, as Galland evidently disciplined himself almost every single night to sum up the day's events. In addition, Galland's remark that the summary would help remind him of the rest indicates an important aspect of his diary as an ego document. His notes not only served the purpose of summing up the day's events in retrospective, but also, and maybe even more so, as a mnemonic device that could serve various purposes in the future, such as that of retelling the tale in oral or written form, or to compare it to other versions he already knew or would encounter later. In this respect, Galland's remark serves as a further contribution to the study of the working mechanisms of a diary and the context of his life, an aspect whose study is currently gaining additional momentum as the autobiographic travelogue of Hannah's journey from Aleppo to Paris and back has just been published in French translation. To conclude, fascinating as the many windows are that an assessment of Galland's early travel diaries in the light of comparative folk narrative research open, one has to admit that the relevant information they contain is certainly secondary in importance to that of his later Parisian diaries. But then we should not forget that during his first day in Constantinople, Galland was not yet the prominent scholar and famed translator of the Nights he later came to be. On his first foreign mission in 1672 to 73, he was a young man of many talents and of little experience. But even though the scholar-to-be was still in the making, Galland's Constantinople diaries already document his avid interest in the narrative culture of Ottoman Turkey and the Near East in general, foreshadowing his later prominence that would link his name immortally to the history of the 1001 Nights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for what is a very appropriate introduction to the whole subject. I was just wondering what happened to that episode of the husband and wife hanging on to the snake's tail in order to get out of the underground. I mean, that also appears elsewhere, does it?
Well, it occurs in several versions, and this again links to a whole, well, big tradition, or even a web of tradition.
Yes.
As there is an overlap between that episode clinging on to the snake's tail and other versions, particularly the European versions of that tale, which I quoted in tale type 612, the three snake leaves. Yes. Because in that tale, there is a snake coming into the burial chamber, and the snake has some leaves that it uses to revive another dead snake. And the man who is down in the cave takes some of the leaves, revives his former wife, and then they leave from there. So there's all kinds of relations between the different versions. Yes.
But please, comments or additions? Yes, Sir Robert.
To get myself clear on this, the Turkish manuscript of Faraj Badr-Shida, I'd always understood that it was ultimately mostly based on Tanuchi's Arabic Faraj Badr-Shida. Am I to understand it comes via a Persian version of this, though? And as a writer question, do you believe in the reality of Dervish Mukhles, the alleged informant of Petit de la Croix for Faraj Badr-Shida, of Emilio Giroux?
Yeah, well, thank you for this short question, which will need a very extensive response.
Yes.
I'm trying to cut that short. First of all, to be clear, the Ottoman manuscript Faraj Badr-Shida has nothing whatsoever to do with Tanuchi's Faraj Badr-Shida. That should be very clear. It just uses the same title, which is, as we know, a generic title, and particularly from the Persian predecessors that were translated into Ottoman and in Ottoman literature, it more or less denotes a collection of tales that follow a similar structure, but that are not necessarily defined as a given unit. Now, the Ottoman 15th century manuscript is based on Persian material. And to the current state of knowledge, we can say that out of the 42 tales in the Ottoman manuscript, at least half were apparently present in single Persian manuscripts in more or less the same order. So say about 20 of those tales were taken as a block from specific Persian manuscripts. We do not have those manuscripts because they would have to be, say, 15th century or older than that. They're not preserved. What we have is 17th and 19th century Persian manuscripts of the same genre, where we have the tales as in Faraj Badr-Shida, the Ottoman manuscript, in the same order. So we can sort of deduce that older manuscripts of that kind might have existed, or must have existed, probably. The other problem is, of course, what is in the second half of the Ottoman manuscript. And I'm currently studying that manuscript in great detail. So I would suggest that this first half, which is taken as a block from Persian manuscripts, actually follows this structure of Ferej Ba'da Shidda, relief after hardship. It's usually a prince in the beginning who has to undergo all kinds of difficulties. And I mean, reading these tales, actually, you're very much reminded of Propp's fairy tale theory, you know, with all the functions you have. You have an adversary, you have a helper, you have all the difficulties that he has to go through. And in the end, of course, he reaches happiness, which is usually documented by power, money, and a beautiful wife. This is a structure of the Ferej Ba'da Shidda tales. But say after tale 20, 25 or so, you have tales of a different genre. You even have funny tales that have nothing whatsoever to do with the same structure or the same message. So it appears that the Ottoman Ferej Ba'da Shidda is partly taken from a single manuscript which had a sort of conclusive content, and the rest has been edited from a variety of sources. So this is a very short answer to a very complicated question. The Dervish Mokhlis. Oh, I should use polite words to say. At one point, I was tempted myself, and I remember writing that some 30 years ago, that Mukhlis, in polite Persian, Mukhlis is a form of denoting yourself. If you say Mukhlis Shama, it means your servant, but you're talking about yourself. So I was thinking whether the Dervish Mukhlis is actually indicating that Petit Lacroix wrote the tales himself, which more or less, I mean, in some extent he did. The Persian Dervish Mukhlis did exist, we know that, because Petit Lacroix had been to Isfahan, actually lived there for three years, whatever, several years. He met the Dervish Mukhlis, and he mentions it in the diaries of that epoch. The Dervish Mukhlis might have been some important person in Isfahan at the period. But then, during his in his travel diaries, Petil never mentions that the Dervish had any manuscript whatsoever, let alone a manuscript of tales or of the 1001 Days. Only when he returned to Paris, and only when he did his translation, he, well, as was the custom of the day, mystified his collection of tales. First of all, he gave it a title to sort of complement the 1001 Days with the 1001 Nights. Then he said, okay, I mean, I'm just conjecturing now. If I publish that and tell people this is from an Ottoman manuscript called Ferej Ba'da Shidda, nobody will read it. Nobody will buy it probably. So he invented all this story. He linked the origin of the tales to the really existing Persian Dervish Mukhlis. He said that he had a manuscript, that I copied the manuscript, or he let me copy the manuscript, that the manuscript was titled 1001 Days, which it definitely was not. There's no Persian manuscript titled 1001 Days, and why should there be? I mean, it would not even make sense. So this is all a big mystification, and I think we're perfectly entitled to presume that part of the initiative that Petit took was also his strong competition with Galland, and of course with Galland's famous collection.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yes. Any more comments? Yes, we do.
Thank you for your very rich presentation. I have two questions. The first is quite easy, I think. Whether you would agree with me that on the basis of the diaries, travel accounts of Galland, you would agree that Galland was in fact fascinated by this kind of narrative material, that all his later complaints in his journals were to cover up, perhaps, his fascination vis-à-vis his more serious colleagues. he was rather insincere in his complaint. The second question is that the picture that emerges from the travel diaries, and which is confirmed by your presentation, that in the period between, let's say, 1500 and 1800, there was a kind of convergence of narrative material from the Persian traditions, Turkish tradition, Arabic tradition, which more or less mingled, being translated or whatever, and collected within, as you say, collections with well, invented titles which have no connection with the material itself. If you see this period as in this perspective, this kind of ferment of well, different traditions coming together, how would this affect our perspective of especially the later compilations of the 1001 Nights, which were compiled at the end of the 18th century? Would you agree that this is also more or less kind of coincidental confluence of narrative material, which was gathered under this title more or less coincidentally?
Okay, thank you. Now the word with your first question that I keep thinking of is the question whether Galland is insincere in his complaints. Well, I'm not Galland, but I'm a scholar of folk narrative studies. And if I get down to complaining about my discipline not being recognized on a large scale, I feel very much like Galland. I mean, I'm doing all these fascinating studies, and I'm very satisfied with what I'm doing. But in comparison to other disciplines, I sometimes feel that my discipline lacks recognition. And I have an idea that Galland was feeling a similar ambiguity. I mean, he did translate the Nights, and I mean, all the beginning of the 18th century, whenever he actually started, he was deeply immersed in translating that. He must have done it more or less every day. And then at the same time, while he's doing that, he says, oh, come on, all these narratives, this is only the only stuff people want to hear. I do not think it's unsincere. It's simply part of the ambiguity that he has, because all his scientific work about coins and antiquities and his collaboration in D'Herbelot's dictionary, that was appreciated. That got him recognition and all that, you know. And again, probably this needs more details because, I mean, as you mentioned in your introduction, in 1709, he was finally made a full professor in today's standards. And this was at a period when he had finally gained, well, not only recognition in France, but more or less worldwide through his translation of the tales. So those tales that he complained about, those entertaining stuff, finally got him the recognition. So I think it's a multi-layered process. Part of it is probably his own question, why am I doing this? Am I doing this for fame? Am I doing this for money? Am I doing this just for the fun of it? And then again, part of it is also the public recognition that he gained in respect to what he was doing.
This implies that he did not grasp the literary value of the text that he was dealing with.
Well, he certainly did not grasp or did not foresee the impact it would have. I think that we can say, well, we can be pretty sure about that. Grasping the literary value of what you're doing at a certain moment is, I guess, sometimes difficult. There's so many works in literature that are only being recognized in their, well, lasting value a long time, say, after the author's death. And so I think Galland fits in very well into a venerable lineage of authors who sort of suffered the same misfortune.
Sorry. Or do you want to say something to the,
Well, the second
the
question.
second question?
Yes, we have not yet reached the second question. Second question, yes, of course there is a mingling of narrative traditions. You mentioned the period 1500 to 1800, which is the period, I understand, of the project, the larger project.
Yes.
So that fits in very well. Feric, the Ottoman manuscript is slightly earlier, but we can even say that the impact of Feric was only as of 1500, so as to make it fit into the project. Now, a mingling might imply that there is a transmission or dissemination in all directions. And I think that is difficult. I could see that, for instance, Arabic sources are partly influenced by Persian. I could see that Persian sources are partly influenced by Arabic. I could say that Ottoman sources are influenced by both Arabic and Persian. But it would be difficult to say that, say, Persian sources are influenced by Ottoman, or Arabic sources are influenced by Ottoman. So there is a certain, say, line of tradition where one national or linguistic tradition builds on another one. But Ottoman tradition probably is the, say, let's final stage. Now, you know as well as I do that Galland was not the first one to translate the 1001 Nights. We had Turkish translations way before that, probably dating back to the 15th century even. Turkish translations that have so far not been studied, and one is perfectly entitled not even to say not been studied in detail, they have not been studied at all. There's a very, very limited body of studies dealing with the Ottoman manuscripts. And I think once one goes down in detail to studying those manuscripts and their relation to the larger narrative tradition, well, one is bound to come up with a couple of surprises or new things that we are going to learn about the larger tradition of the Knights after, well, 1500. I think we still have a lot to learn. And I mean, again, we are very much in a similar situation. We are dealing with a field that has been inspiring scholarship for so long, but the more we deal with it, the more we find questions that we'd like to answer.
Well, I think we better have a pause there. We have, in fact, caught up with our timetable in spite of the absence of Ibrahim Akel, and we will have a little pause for coffee and croissant before the talk of Robert Irwin. But thank you so much.